Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Let's today briefly discuss about the exception handling in Spring Boot 2, that is particularly with Spring Framework version 5. Our general motivation is to code our RESTful application with meaningful response for every request with appropriate status codes to the clients. This will certainly help the clients to identify the problem that might have occurred in the application while dealing with the request. Generally, in a Spring Boot application, whenever you request for a resource from the server and it couldn't find the requested resource, it always complains with the following error format with a basic error controller. Under the /error pattern, we have the default fields with timestamp, status, error, message, trace, which is the stack trace of the following error message and the respective path. Generally, we want to override this default behavior in our enterprise applications, and we tend to customize with our own format globally throughout the application for all types of exception to return the appropriate exception to the client. We are going to briefly discuss about the following annotations involved in the exception handling of Spring Boot 2. We have @ControllerAdvice, @ExceptionHandler, @ResponseStatus, and most importantly, we have the class called ResponseStatusException, which is introduced in Spring version 5. We will discuss briefly on all of these things. This is a Spring Boot application we have for the demo project. You could find the GitHub URL in the description below. Here we are having the newborn baby controller, and we are having the endpoints with the HTTP methods getMapping, @postMapping, and @deleteMapping. When you try to retrieve the list of babies, you go for /babies, which will give you the list of babies available in the server. When you try to hit a specific baby endpoint using the /babies/id endpoint in the postman, and if the requested resource is not available in the server, it complains you with the following error format with fields timestamp, status, error, message, and trace. You could find the status code as 500. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna override the default behavior what a Spring Boot application provides to us. Whenever any exception is thrown from any controller of the application, the common behavior in the Spring Boot is the @ControllerAdvice will intercept those exceptions and will add some information to the exception on top of it before returning to the client. ControllerAdvice is an annotation introduced in Spring 3 and as the name suggests, it is an advice for multiple controllers. It is used to enable a single exception handler to be applied for multiple controllers. The most important thing is the response entity exception handler. It's a base class. We can extend all our classes to this base class, which provides a centralized exception handling across all the different exception handler methods. Under the response entity exception handler class, we have the handle exception method, which will handle all the exceptions of different types. We will quickly pick this method signature, handle exception, and we will try to override the default behavior. We will annotate this method with the exception handler. And we will specify what type of exception it needs to handle across all controllers. We will go for global exception object. And since we need to override this, we need to rename this method name. Be it any type of exception occurring in the application, we try to create a certain format and return that particular format to the client. In order to do that, we will create a new class and we will initiate all the fields inside the class, and we will try to return the same object irrespective of any exception type occurring in the application. We will go for exception response class. To save time, I have already created the class called exception response, which I will show you in a minute. We are having the following fields in the exception response class with timestamp, message, and details. We will quickly populate the values. For now, we aren't going for include client info with false. And ultimately, this method will expect response entity object to be returned. We will append this exception response object to the response entity class and return it. We will go for constructor with tbody and http status, which we will populate with the exception response object and http status with internal server error, which is the code 500. Now we have provided the format which has to be returned for all the exception types. Now what shall we do is, we will go and trigger this particular endpoint searching for a single baby information with /babies/id. Now we shall see if we are requesting for the baby information with id 5, it will override the default behavior what we have developed so far. Here you can see the custom bean what we have defined in the exception response class with timestamp, message, and default and details fields accordingly. But the status code what it has returned is 500 internal server error, but ideally whenever the requested resource is not available in the server, we always go for returning 404. We will do that now. Here, this particular service method, whenever requested baby information it is not found, I am always throwing baby not found exception with the following constructor information. Now, in order to make sure we return 404 status code, we implement at response status on top of the class baby not found exception. And with the following error code, http status not found 404. We will import the response status Ctrl+Shift+O. Hereafter, whenever baby not found exception happens across any controller in the application, always it throws with 404. We will create the appropriate handler exception for this baby not found exception class. and change this exception class to specific baby not found exception. And we will do the same in the argument as well. And we shall change the response code to 404 accordingly. Now the expected behavior is whenever user tries to search for a specific baby and couldn't find the resource on the server, SpringBoot throws the exception and the control comes to this ControllerAdvice class, and the appropriate exception handler tries to catch the specific baby not found exception, and then it appends the corresponding response with a status code with http status.notfound, and then it constructs the bean with exception response and then returns back to the client. Now the response code should change from 500 to 404. Yeah. We have seen that the @ControllerAdvice annotation allows us to consolidate our multiple scattered @exception handlers from before screens into a single global error handling component. The actual mechanism was extremely simple but also very flexible. It gave us full control over the body of the response as well as the status code. Mapping of several exceptions to the same method to be handled together was extremely advantageous thing. That is, we have mapped the handle all exceptions with the same method name across all exception types. You can go for exception, baby not found exception, and other types of exception found in the application. One important thing to note that to match the exception handler declared here with the exception used in the argument of the method. If they aren't matching, the compiler will not complain. But at runtime, the exception resolving mechanism will fail, throwing illegal state exception. No suitable resolver for argument 0 is found. Coming back to @responseStatus annotation, one drawback is it creates tight coupling with exception. In our example, all exceptions of type baby not found exception will generate the same error message and the status code in the response. In order to overcome this, we will go for @responseStatusException annotation introduced in Spring version 5. For this try-catch block, we will go on and throw ResponseStatusException class with a specified constructor. Here we are going for the constructor with 3 arguments, one with status, second with reason, and then the actual cause of the exception. We shall define this as HTTP status code not found, and then for the reason we will copy this, and then for the cause, which is the throwable type, we shall go with E, which is the variable in the catch block. Now the exception of the same type, baby not found exception, can lead to multiple different responses. Here, the main benefits of response status exception are like the exceptions of the same type, for example, baby not found exception, can be processed separately and different status codes can be set on the response. For example, here we are going for HTTP status not found And we can also have a different catch block, or for another method we can go for the same baby not found exception with a different status code, say like http status code dot internal server error or bad request, something like that. So for this one type we are having the multiple status codes. This reduces tight coupling compared to the @exception handler. The most important thing is that we aren't creating any custom exception classes, as we did in @responseStatus. Now we will quickly hit the same endpoint and let's see how the response is turning out. Yes. Here you can see the timestamp and the message what ResponseStatusException is throwing from there and the details. The general trade-off is we can combine @ControllerAdvice as well as @ResponseStatusException. For example, we can implement @ControllerAdvice here in globally, and also we can make sure we implement @ResponseStatusException locally. However, we need to be careful. If the same exception can be handled in multiple ways, we may notice some surprising behavior. A possible convention is to handle one specific kind of exception always in one way. Either we can go for @ControllerAdvice or @ResponseStatusException. That's all we have got for exception handling in Spring Boot up to the latest version of Spring 5. Don't forget to subscribe my channel so you don't miss notifications as and when I'm posting further videos. Meet you in the next video. Until then, this is Ratin Maheshwaran signing off. Bye bye.